Wulfgar's Folly. Lorimer dragged the wounded Gastelm back behind the crumbling defense line as green light lanced through the air, melting the barricade. The Insta-Create bulkhead dissolved under the unrelenting storm of Gauss fire, atomized mid-structure, slag and dust, raining down like ash. Withermund fired a concentrated beam from his melta, hitting true. The Doomsday Arc erupted as its core shielding failed, imploding into a collapsing sphere of emerald flame, disintegrating tank and crew alike. The Necron warriors who survived the initial blast were caught moments later in a rolling surge of witchfire, conjured by Gastward Cuthhelm. Cuthhelm laughed, voice echoing over the ruin, as the flayed machine soldiers writhed and burned in spectral fire. Then Tunbald pulled him down from the wall. They retreated as another wave of Necrons marched over their own dead, utterly without pause, obliterating the remains of the shattered defensive perimeter. The last few Fraterus militia, too wounded to flee and too faithful to yield, stood with arms raised in defiance. Their flesh was flayed from their skulls, still bearing the faintest expressions of joy in the Emperor's service, turning to dust mid-prayer. Lorimer and Withermund laid down suppressing fire as they fell back alongside the captain and the Gastward. Wulfgar, the chaplain, reached down, seizing the one-armed form of Tunbald, and hauled him bodily over the final barricade. The wall shuddered with incoming fire. Wulfgar took a moment to survey the scene. The lost outer defense, hastily built by tearing flagstones from the ancient roadway, a last desperate attempt to slow the advance down the high road and shield the exposed Void Revenants' flank. Smoke, blood, dust, green lightning, silence between blasts. Nothing remained now but the redoubt, the last holdfast before the inner sanctum. Necron forces advanced up the incline, rank upon rank, grinding their dead beneath their heel plates. Their optics glowed in cold, unfeeling unity. Above them, another arc hovered, its cannon glowing as it aligned with the redoubt's gate. The road was lost. Wulfgar clenched his Crozius. He turned toward the others. His voice, when it came, was as cold and clear as prophecy. "Now," Wulfgar bellowed. "Be cowards for a moment. Fall back!" The line broke, not in panic, but with perfect, brutal discipline. The Void Revenants withdrew in bounding steps toward the secondary redoubt, where Godric and Osric stood amidst the broken ruins, their weapons thunderous. Cuthhelm and Tunbald barked orders to the defenders still holding the ward wall, bolters cracking as they fell back, step by step. Wulfgar turned to cover the retreat. A towering Necron emerged on the ridge above, wielding a weapon larger than a man. The green beam it unleashed struck true. 2 Gastelms were instantly vaporized, their armor reduced to smoke and charred icons. Wulfgar charged through the haze, Crozius raised high. The next blast tore through his pauldron, the golden skull icon atomized in a burst of emerald flame. His vision swam with static. Warning sigils flared across his helm. He snarled, ripping free the molten shoulder plate, his gauntlet white-hot, steaming as he pressed forward. "The Emperor's hand fights the Xenos," he roared. The Crozius came down with righteous fury, shattering the Necron warrior. The impact cracked its armored torso in half. Its weapons spilled a reservoir of liquefied energy, melting stone, metal, and nearby warriors alike. Green plasma pooled, hissing and boiling as the surrounding Xenos dissolved in their own power discharge. Runes blinked red across Wulfgar's HUD. His armor was failing, his boot fusing to the stone, but he saw what mattered. The distraction had worked. Necron formations had stalled, thrown into chaotic delay by their own overkill. He limped through the ruin toward the redoubt, dragging his shattered leg, Crozius still glowing like a dying sun. The hulking form of Godric's dreadnought loomed above the barricade. One massive claw reached down. Wulfgar collapsed against the dreadnought's flank as the heavy flamer ignited, sweeping the slope clean in a wall of roaring promethium. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the hymn of bolters resumed, a chorus of defiance. Wulfgar sprayed sealant foam across his knee joint. The hiss and crackle echoed faintly in his helm. He grunted, forcing himself upright, servo motors whining under the strain. Osric appeared beside him. One of the Tech Marines' mechadendrites reached out, seized a fallen pauldron, still bearing the siege company insignia, and welded it onto Wulfgar's wounded armor. The old iron hissed and sparked into place. Wulfgar looked down at the plate, burned, scorched, but the symbol endured. A flicker of shame touched him. wearing another brother's plate, but then his gaze fell to his plasma pistol, the grip engraved with the names of chaplains past, 5 millennia of sacrifice. He bowed his head once, then rose to his full height. All around the redoubt, Void Revenants held firm. Bolters roared, plasma hissed. Crimson tracers and blue arcs of energy bathed the ancient temple walls in flickering light. Osric, multitasking with surgical calm, rearmed a wounded Astartes while his mechadendrites fired over the barricade. "I believe we have their attention," he said dryly over the vox. Godric's dreadnought turned, scarred and pitted from 100 Gauss strikes. "Then now or never," he rumbled. His voice was metallic. Final. He opened fire. Autocannons thundered point-blank into the Necron lines, shattering bodies in molten fragments. Wulfgar turned to Cuthhelm. "Are your wraiths ready?" Cuthhelm raised one hand, summoning a wall of ice-like energy, which deflected a Gauss beam meant for the dreadnought. For a heartbeat he opened his mind, seeing a beach, ghostly surf, and Elfric waiting within it, and sent the signal. He nodded once. Wulfgar climbed the rubble. His Crozius rose like a beacon. Vox amplifiers carried his voice across the blood-soaked ruins. "Geofon Hālgengas," he roared. "Fegaword!" The call reverberated across the field, a phrase older than the Imperium. Within a shattered temple, overlooked by the advancing Xenos, runesmith Torhern heard the battle cry echo over the Vox. He turned to the ghast helms crouched beside him. They had waited in hiding for the entire battle, held in reserve for this moment alone. The words hit like thunder. "We have tarried long enough. Let our blades bite deep," Torhern roared, bursting from the shadows, his power axe igniting in crackling blue arcs. The ghast helms surged with him, bolters roaring as they poured fire into the Necrons encircling the redoubt. From the opposite flank came Hearthguard Cinnabil, leading the first squad, 2nd Company. Their cataphractii plate glowed with heat and soot, the slow, unstoppable march of living siege engines. Cinnabil's power hammer rose and fell in brutal arcs, smashing Necrons into molten shards. His brothers advanced behind him, storm bolters blazing, hand flamers spraying tongues of fire, crushing the machine horde with power fists and industrial chain blades better suited to shipyard work than war. From the heart of the redoubt came the counterattack proper, a phalanx of gray-armored Void Revenants, carving into a sea of metal skulls. Necron eyes guttered out one by one, fading like dying stars. Wulfgar vaulted the barricade, crushing a Necron beneath his boots as he landed. His Crozius whirled, every strike a blur of burning faith, cracking necrodermis and shattering skull helms. Osric leapt after him with manic laughter, swinging his massive power axe in vicious strokes. 4, 5, 6, he shouted, sparks showering from his armor. He spun, splitting another pair. 7, 8, a final downward blow cleaved one clean in two. 9, he charged into the next rank with gleeful fury. Behind them the earth shook. Godric strode over the redoubt, his sarcophagus wreathed in fire and smoke. From his back he drew a weapon suited only for his colossal frame, a 10-foot adamantine battle axe, its haft as thick as a man's torso. He swung once. A path 10 feet wide was cleared. He swung again. 20 more feet vanished into ruin. Necrons were hurled aside, limbs spinning through the air like silver shrapnel. Inside the sarcophagus, Godric's laughter rumbled like a furnace. "Fegword!" he roared. "Fegword!" The cry was taken up across the redoubt. Void Revenants surged forward, a tide of iron and wrath. Seexes and power swords rose and fell. The sons of Nitworth burned through the Xenos like a forge flame through oil. Cuthhelm made to charge, but Tunbald blocked him with the stump of his arm. "Not you, fool! We need your wraiths!" The librarian halted, forced himself back into cover. He opened his mind, reaching into the immaterium, but felt nothing from the Necron dead. No psychic presence, no offering, no souls. They would have to power the summons alone. Was it enough? As if hearing that desperate thought, Deacon Absalon climbed a shattered plinth where a burning predator lay cracked in half. "The Emperor's eye watches you. He sees your deeds. For the Emperor!" The Fraterus militia charged. The first wave were atomized crossing the wall, but the waves behind did not break. They hurled flamers across the enemy ranks. Shotguns and battered auto-weapons barked uselessly against necrodermis, yet they charged all the same. Seeing them falter, Absalon drew his sword and leaped down, screaming, "Emperor! Fegword!" He carved through a Necron, then another, as the militia leapt onto the enemy, smashing them with relics, blessed hammers, and charred Seek's blades. The Welsiak's crew surged after them, wielding spanners, hammers, and las cutters in wild fury. Captain Sigabild, unable to hold them back, cursed and charged with them, felling a Necron officer with a single blow of Tempest's Bite. "For Welsiaks!" Void Lieutenant Harrogith tried to hold her Void armsmen in formation, but they too charged. She shouted for discipline, then saw Ordmare run past her, screaming a prayer with a power stave raised. She exhaled, shook her head, drew her blade, and turned to those who remained. "For Nitwertha!" And she plunged after them. The Voidsmen and crewmen, with their ecclesiarch allies, formed a wedge of iron and flame, cutting deep into the Necron lines. Wulfgar saw it happen, saw humanity refuse extinction, and charged after the deacon, Gasthelms racing beside him. The Necrons faltered. Those scaling the redoubt walls slipped, falling into their own ranks. For the first time the advance broke. Along the high road, the silver and bronze lines of the Cryptek Guard buckled inward. A Doomsday Ark exploded under a Melta charge. Another was swarmed by priests who tore the gunner from the turret, heedless of their own wounds. High above, Elfstan watched from his vantage point, his voice sharp over the Vox. "They're clearing the path," he reported. Beside him, Herewolf leaned over a hololith feed projected from a hovering servo skull, his one good eye narrowed. "I believe," he said quietly, "the Iron King is less a fool than you think." Elfstan scanned the battlefield, searching for whatever it was Herewolf had seen or sensed. For a moment, all he could make out was the burning haze and the fractured gleam of Necron metal under the redoubt's guns. "Where is that damned Elfric?" "Sulking, probably," replied Herewolf. Far above the battle atop the turnpike at the head of the road, Drazek Thek Anakote, atop his Doomsday Ark, watched as his Cryptek Guard were thrown back. He reviewed the assault lines breaching the road length roll downwards in retreat. In the back of his mind, he felt the thoughts of the King of Iron Konk Drakarak viewing his strategy. He felt the disdain for him, but ignored it. The enemy had played their final hand, the last card in their commander's hand. Drazek knew there would be a reserve. In every war he had fought, from the war in heaven to the skirmishes with the Commonwealth colonists who had stumbled upon their necropolises millennia ago, there was always a reserve. Some deployed openly as a threat, most hidden, a final trick that could turn victory into sudden defeat. Drazek had seen them all, and now here the humans had revealed theirs, cataphracti terminators. Not that he knew their name, some form of elite warrior caste, clearly. But it did not matter. Good, he thought. The reserve was committed. Now it was time for his own. Drazek lamented that the King of Iron, while an effective commander, always overlooked the lesser creations under his command. He relied on his Cryptek Guard and Royal Warden cohort, failing to see the potential of the drones, the maintenance forms, the forgotten relics of war that polished sarcophagi and scrubbed pipes while their masters slumbered. Arrogance begets ignorance, and ignorance leads to complacency. Drazek was neither. He sent the command, from the low drainage culverts that threaded beneath the ancient city. From the stagnant pools gathered in the drowned monoliths and sunken temples, from the fissures torn into the earth by the crash of some long-dead starship, they came. Scarabs, a tide of them, swarming outward from every shadowed crevice, like liquid metal spilling over the battlefield. The sunken streets and broken plazas came alive with movement. The ground itself seemed to ripple and crawl. The Gasthelms of the Second Company, pressing the attack, suddenly found themselves beset from behind. The victorious advance turned into a trap. The scarabs struck like a wave, climbing over armor, cutting through ceramite with diamond-edged mandibles. Power cables were sheared, seals breached, flesh and machine both torn apart beneath the crawling tide. Bolters fired point-blank into the mass, tearing it apart by the hundreds. Flamers hissed, wreathing the air in fire. But still they came, a living storm of metallic claws, unstoppable, unending. Within seconds, the ground around the redoubt was a carpet of skittering shapes. The screams of dying Astartes merged with the shrill, mechanical chorus of chittering machines. Runesmith Torharn, who had been holding the eastern roadway open for the second squad of the Grey Company and Sigabild's men, turned as the swarm poured toward him. He unleashed fire from his flamer, a searing trench of promethium carving through the scarabs. When the tank ran dry, he cast it aside. "Come on," he roared, waving the Astartes forward. "Run!" Drawing his twin pistols, he fired into the tide until both weapons overheated, barrels glowing white. Then he drew his blade and waded into the mass, hacking and crushing the skittering constructs as they crawled over him. Necron warriors climbed behind the scarabs, firing as they came. One beam sliced across his helm, half melting his faceplate. Another struck his sword, turning it into molten slag. He staggered, snarling, eyes blazing behind cracked lenses. "Fagward!" he screamed, drawing his Sikhs and plunging into the nearest foe. Lormer fired wildly now, no longer picking targets. It was just a carpet of death. He screamed, "Fagward!" as the scarabs reached him. From behind, he was grabbed. Witherman dragged him back. Both men turned and sprinted. Toonbald was forming a firing line, gas helms falling as scarabs swarmed up their bodies, dissolving them alive. It was too far. They wouldn't make it. Then, with a rush of exhaust fumes, Captain Phaon flew overhead, his jump pack flaring. He seized both warriors by the pauldrons and dragged them bodily into the defense line. They collapsed in a heap behind the barricades as Phaon's sword passed, saluting Toonbald as he passed. Bolter fire cracked through the smoke in rapid, rhythmic bursts, so fast it sounded like a single roaring engine. Toonbald and his men fired in disciplined volleys, shredding scarabs and necrons alike. Explosions tore gaps through the crawling swarm as the beleaguered squad fell back through the corridor of clearing fire. Toonbald extended a gauntleted hand toward Torhern, dragging him free of the writhing metallic mass. The runesmith shook off the carcasses of burnt scarabs clinging to his armor. "My thanks," he growled. Toonbald gave a sharp nod and moved on, his warriors forming a moving wall of bolter fire to carve their way through the chaos. In the center, Osric saw them coming. His melta blazed, turning the first ranks of scarabs into pools of bubbling metal. He swung his axe in great sweeps, cleaving through the survivors and snatching a wounded Gasthelm from the swarm's grip before the marine was torn apart. Gastweird Cuthhelm moved through the smoke like a phantom, the flames of his hand flamer licking from the crook of his arm. The scent of scorched oil and burnt metal filled the air as he advanced, each burst of fire washing across the oncoming tide of scarabs and skeletal forms. The Necrons pressed forward, their bronze skulls gleaming with reflections of the flame. One raised a staff crowned with a flickering emerald node, its wielder, a Necron lord, advancing through the inferno utterly unbothered. Cuthelm's vox crackled with strain as he spoke a single word of hate and prayer. His free hand rose, the air shimmered, the ground trembled beneath the weight of his will. He reached out with his mind. A broken pillar, one of the ancient supports of the tomb city, shuddered, lifted from its base with a groan that echoed across the cavern. For a heartbeat it hung suspended, haloed in dust and firelight, then came crashing down like an ironclad dropping from orbit. The Necron Lord turned too slowly. The pillar struck, shattering its body into fragments of molten alloy and crackling circuitry. Cuthelm's eyes blazed white behind his helm lenses as he swept the battlefield. He saw Wulfgar fall beneath a rolling tide of scarabs, the chaplain vanishing under a wave of glimmering mandibles and steel limbs. "Not him," Cuthelm whispered. "Not him." The warp answered. The air split with psychic force, an invisible lash that ripped the scarabs apart mid-swarm, scattering them into molten shards. The ground rippled under the concussive blast as Wulfgar's body rolled clear. Cuthelm reached out, his mind an iron grip, and pulled. Wulfgar's armored frame jerked upright as if lifted by unseen chains. "On your feet, Scop," Cuthelm growled through gritted teeth, his voice shaking with exhaustion and fury. With his other hand he summoned the last of his strength. A curtain of fire roared into being, a wall of living flame that poured across the ruined causeway, devouring the advancing scarabs. Their shrieks mingled with the crack of burning air and the psychic hum of the Gastward's mind. From the redoubt above, Wulfgar looked down, watching as Cinnabil and his cataphractii pushed their charge. Cinnabil swung his thunderhammer, smashing the leg off a tripod construct that toppled to the ground. Then he heard a scream. One of his cataphractii lay on the stones, his armor rent open, melting in green fire. Drazik Thek Anakot stepped over the fallen Terminator. Cryptek guards surged past him, but he steadied them with a gesture. The first group that ignored him were cut down instantly by Stormbolter fire and lightning claws. "Use your mind, not your blade," the blade of the king scolded coldly. He stepped forward alone. 2 cataphractii terminators faced him, one bearing a chain fist and Stormbolter, the other twin lightning claws. Drazak bowed to his opponents. Then he moved. He darted forward, slipping between them. The Stormbolter tracked his motion, too slow, its rounds instead seething across the lightning claw terminator, staggering him back. Drazak sliced through the Stormbolter with a crackling arc of his blade. He seized the chain fist, twisting it. Servos sparked, armor plates buckled, and with a brutal wrench he drove the spinning chain blade into the Terminator's own chest, eviscerating him inside his armor. He stepped aside as the second Terminator struck. Lightning claws tore gouges across his necrodermis, but the living metal knitted itself whole even as he moved. With a single sweeping cut, he severed both lightning claws, then twisted his war scythe and impaled the warrior through his faceplate. The cataphractii collapsed, smoldering, dissolving from the head downward. Siptech Guard watched in silence, processing, assimilating. Their commander, whom they had considered incapable of martial prowess, stood wreathed in smoke and shattered ceramite. None of them knew that Drazak had trained with Threxek Thek Mharak, battle commander of the king's armies. Drazak savored the sudden respect. Then he turned to face the enemy. Cynabil cut down the last of the scarabs and looked upon his fallen brothers. He raised his hammer and pointed directly at the Necron Lord. "You," he bellowed, voice echoing across the ruin. "You end here." Drazek Thenukot regarded the Hearthguard with an eye for danger. He assessed the hammer, calculating its impact, noted the warrior's damaged armor, servos rigged to full capacity, saw the split along the left side of the cuirass, and the helmet inclusion granting a blind spot 20 degrees to the left. Even the loose cords trailing from the hammer's power pack did not escape his gaze. He bowed, lowering his blade respectfully, angled to the left, just outside the warrior's field of vision. Cynabil charged, putting all his weight into a sweeping strike aimed to catch the Necron Lord's flank. Drazak sidestepped, blade flashing unseen, severing the hammer's power feed in a single slice. A steel heel struck the opposite leg plate, and Cynabil staggered, unbalanced as the servos in his armor overcompensated and exploded outward. Drazak passed beside him. The hilt of his blade slammed against the weakened chest plate. Cynabil folded inwards as his ribs shattered, blood spitting into his helmet, one lung collapsing and the other filling with fluid. His primary heart stopped. He twitched, helpless on the ground. Up above, Wulfgar saw the fall and cursed. Gastweird Cuthhelm leapt forward, only to be caught mid-air by Godric, who hurled him back to the battlements. The librarian snarled, staff raised in fury. "Go, you fool," the dreadnought thundered. "We need wraiths, not a dead Gastweird." Godric vaulted from the parapet himself, 10-foot axe carving a chasm through the seething swarm. Molten metal sprayed in all directions with each swing. Wulfgar nodded to Cuthhelm, then leapt after the dreadnought. Behind them, the redoubt burned. Cuthhelm turned from the fight for a moment, looking toward where Fond and Tumbald made their final stand. All were dying. All was lost. "Elfric!" he cried, not just into the battlefield, but into the warp itself. "Elfric!" He cut down a Necron, tore a scarab from a struggling Navy armsman. Below, the deacon swung his blade at a spider-like machine. Harrogith lay motionless beside him, bleeding out. Vox Officer Ordmer stood over her, swinging his Vox unit like a hammer. Captain Sigabield embedded Tempest Bite into the thorax of the mechanical beast. Voices rang out across the battlements. "For Walsiax! Geofon Hālgengas! Feg word!" Necrons swarmed everywhere. Still he called again, "Elfric!" Wulfgar charged down the wall, leaping after the dreadnought. A handful of Astartes and Osric followed, axes and Crozius rising amid the burning tide. The redoubt vanished behind them, swallowed by scarabs. They saw Godric in the fray, scarabs crawling across his sarcophagus, their mandibles carving glowing trails into ceramite. With each swing of his massive axe, he sheared apart scores of the enemy. A gassed helm of the 8th Company dropped down beside him, flame spewing over the swarm, only to be torn apart seconds later. Drazak watched from above. He saw the lumbering dreadnought frame close and regarded it with disdain. An ancient war machine, pistons and pumps replacing failed hearts and lungs. Not offensive in form, but in memory. He raised his blade in salute, but the ironclad gave no honor in return. Godric lunged. His massive axe swung, but Drazek severed it mid-motion, blade slicing the haft like paper. Godric dropped the ruined weapon and brought his twin autocannons to bear, but Drazek was already inside his reach. A flick of his blade, and the ammunition drums exploded. Godric's right arm was torn free. He swung his claw, igniting the flamer built into his forearm. Drazek cut through the joint, severing tendons and piston alike. Inside the sarcophagus, alarms shrieked. Armor integrity plummeted. A green beam lanced across the dreadnought, severing a shoulder plate. A scarab chewed through the servo feeds. Others burrowed into the power core. The Necron Lord stepped forward, impaling the sarcophagus with a single contemptuous thrust. Amber runes turned crimson. Casket breach. Imminent. Godric staggered, dragging his frame forward. Drazek stepped aside. The dreadnought collapsed over the broken body of Cinnabil. With one final act, he swung his claw and cleaved a Necron warrior in half. Scarabs covered him. Inside, the smell of burned flesh filled the coffin. Drazek observed silently as the dying machine toppled down the road, crushing Necron formations. He sent a minor threat alert ahead, but these were the king's mindless legions. It was not a priority. Within the casket, Godric's world darkened. The dreadnought systems failed, but something inside him refused silence. One final act. He tore his faceplate free. Steam hissed. For the first time in centuries, he saw with his own eyes. The swarm covered him. One scarab climbed to his chest, its beam cutting into his skull. "Wulfgar!" he roared through static and blood. "Geofon Hālg." The signal died. Inside his mind, a final thought bloomed. "Release engine safeties. Confirm, confirm." A brilliant sun bloomed in the heart of the redoubt. The explosion tore the Necron lines apart, vaporizing hundreds in an instant. A mastaba collapsed, crushing others. Shattered scarabs fell like burning glass. Drazek Thek Anukot watched the explosion with little outward expression. The falling rain hissed as it met the fire. It reminded him of something. He wasn't sure what, but the thought was interrupted as he turned back toward the battle. Two new figures approached. One in black, Baroque armor with a skull-faced helm, the other nearly more machine than man, festooned with servo arms, optics, and attachments that seemed more burden than benefit. Drazek gave a metaphorical sigh, almost tragic in its silence. He raised his blade. Wulfgar stood with what remained of his brothers, Osric at his side, fewer than a dozen Astartes, still alive. Around them lay dozens of dismembered cryptek guards, their twisted bodies forming a metal graveyard beneath the driving rain. Wulfgar raised his Crozius and bellowed a challenge. Drazek responded with a formal bow, but the barbarians, these alien commanders, charged without ceremony. Drazek felt something sink in his soul. Were there none left with honor among these creatures? He leapt forward, and Astartes met him. Drazek's blade sliced the warrior cleanly in half. Ignoring the skull-faced one, he turned toward Osric. The runesmith swung his axe, an arc of silver in the storm, but Drazek moved beneath it, thrusting upward. His blade cut through Osric's arm, severing it at the elbow. The axe flew, spinning end over end, embedding itself in a cryptek guard's skull before vanishing into the mist. Drazek pressed on. In a blur of movement, he severed two of Osric's mechadendrite-mounted weapons. Plasma and melta-barrels spun away, clattering into the flooded rubble. Then the Necron Lord swept his blade low, carving through Osric's leg at the knee. The ceramite shattered with a scream of failing servos. Osric collapsed beside the broken form of Cinnabil. But even broken, Osric was not finished. With his remaining hand, he drew the sildathnidal, that crystalline relic of ancient make. He raised it to fire, but Drazek caught it by the muzzle and tore it from his grasp. He turned the weapon in his hand, recognizing the form, the weight, the ancient patterning. Not this exact one, but the make, the design. A weapon forged long ago to slay both Neverborn and Necron alike. His eyes dimmed with memory. Konthek Drac had banned them from his kingdom, decrying them as crude and heretical. A mistake, Drazek had always thought. He pointed the weapon at Osric's chest and fired. Both of the runesmith's hearts skipped a beat. The sudden shock sent him into unconsciousness. Drazek looked down once more at the weapon, then tossed it into the mud with disgust. He saw Wulfgar rallying the last of the Astartes, aiming his Crozius. Drazik turned and strode away. Beside the wreckage, Cinnabil pulled off his helmet and spat blood onto the rain-slick roadway. He looked to Osric's broken body and crawled over, reaching out to grasp his pauldron. Osric stirred. His vision swam. One of his hearts beat erratically, the other was still. He sent a command through his armor's interface. His heart jolted, shocking back into rhythm. He breathed again with difficulty. His augmented eye was ruined. The HUD was dead, but he knew the damage was grave. He looked at the Hearthguard. "Still with us, brother," he rasped. Cinnabil, voice raw but carrying its iron humor, replied, "Still here, brother." Osric coughed, blood dripping from his lip. "I thought things couldn't get worse," he said. "I was wrong." Cinnabil tried to move. His armor was inert. Sealing foam covered more of it than paint. "What could be worse?" he asked. Rain began to fall anew, thick, oily drops sizzling on scorched ceramite and molten stone. Osric groaned, using his remaining hand to spray foam into the shattered mess of his breastplate. Behind the broken grill of his helmet, he managed to grin. "It's raining, and the deacon had all the umbraculums." Cinnabil laid back. Above him, a Necron Cryptek guard loomed, blade raised. He looked up and asked, "You got an umbraculum?" The Necron paused. Confusion flickered in its thought protocols. A logic error triggered a threat warning, but before it could resolve, Osric reached for the Sildath Natal lying beside him. He fired point blank. The Necron's soul severed from its body in an instant. It collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, crashing to the wet stone in a heap of rain, blood, and silence. Drazik marched toward Wulfgar. This wasn't the Wulfgar he had known, not Commander Wulfgar of the Commonwealth of Man's ancient expeditions. No, this was another, a different man, yet the same face. Curious. Clearly, the skull-faced helm had become a symbol of leadership among humanity in the millennia since. How interesting. Especially, Drazik mused, as it was he who had taken the original Wulfgar's face in the first place. He had made a mistake then. He had not killed him. He would not make that mistake again. Wulfgar saw him. He saw the bodies of his brothers scattered across the rain-slick causeway. Their eyes locked, green lenses meeting necrotic emerald fire. "For the Emperor!" Wulfgar roared, raising his Crozius. His plasma pistol fired, shot after shot flaring against the Necron Lord's shimmering force field. Drazik's barrier cracked and spat sparks. Plasma strikes melted gouges into his skeletal frame, but he did not stop. He advanced through the storm. They met in the center of the carnage. Drazik swung his blade. Wulfgar deflected it with his Crozius, the two power fields screeching as they kissed. The Necron Lord seized the muzzle of the plasma pistol, firing point blank. The weapon discharged. The explosion vaporized Drazik's hand, destroyed the pistol, and ruined Wulfgar's gauntlet in one molten burst. Cursing, Wulfgar kicked Drazik back, then swung low with the Crozius. Drazik's blade met the haft in a twist of motion, meant to disarm. But Wulfgar anticipated. He shifted his grip, caught Drazik's Gauss blade on the haft's edge, and snapped it. The Necron's weapon shattered in the rain. "For the Emperor!" Wulfgar cried again, bringing his Crozius down on the unarmed Xenos Lord. But Drazik caught his wrist. The servos in Wulfgar's iron hand screamed, then failed. The Crozius fell. Drazik seized it mid-fall and smashed it into the chaplain's face, shattering the skull mask helm and driving Wulfgar to the ground. Drazik stood over him, his silhouette monstrous in the rain. He raised the Crozius. Wulfgar tried to pull his bolt pistol, but his fingers were ruined, useless. His vision swam. Blood filled his mouth. "Fag a word," he spat. Drazik relished the moment. Victory. Vengeance. All those years ago, he had failed to kill the first Wulfgar. This one, he would not fail. With the enemy leader dead, the rest would fall. And when he returned, he would seize the head of that damned Konthek Drak Arak and claim the Iron King's realm for his own. He swung the Crozius. A staff intercepted it mid-air, sparks erupting from the collision. The weapon dropped beside Wulfgar, clattering to the stone. Standing above the fallen chaplain was Elfric, a wraith, a ghost, a revenant. He looked imperiously down at the Necron Lord. Rain hissed through his incorporeal form, but his eyes burned. Drazik's processes hesitated. The figure before him was translucent, no heat, no displacement of air. His threat matrix logged it as a hologram. No threat, no action required. Elfric's blade swept in a blur. The strike split Drazik's necrodermis cleanly. His upper half hit the ground with a wet clang. Alert sigils screamed in error, too late. His entire thought process was based on false assumptions. This wraith was not a hologram, and it was raining. Drazik vanished in a blink, phasing out, not to the Iron King's necropolis, but to Karelak Nak, far from shame. He understood, too late, the battle was lost. Elfric's shade looked down at Wulfgar. His staff shimmered. Pain racked Wulfgar's hand as his broken fingers snapped back into place. Elfric nodded once, then was gone. From the corner of his eye, Wulfgar saw movement. A towering Necron loomed above, skeletal and gleaming, a glaive raised to strike. Wulfgar lifted his pistol, an Iron Hands relic once gifted to him by Mentis. He fired. The shot hit center mass, blasting a chunk of glowing alloy from the Xeno's chest, but it kept coming. The blade rose, then, whispering light, a sword of ghost fire swept through the air, severing the Necron in half. Wulfgar blinked. "Fagward!" came a distant cry, echoing as if from deep water. He staggered to his feet. Around him, the last Void Revenant stood back to back, bleeding, broken, but alive. Osric was dragging Cinnabil, both wounded. And there, he saw them. The true Revenants, ghostly warriors in full battle plate, glowing faintly with the pale bioluminescence of Ghastlioma spores. Bolters, Seekses, hammers, flamers, blurred, shimmering. Each blow struck with real weight. "Geofon Hālgengas," someone cried, voice eternal. The spectral warriors surged forward. Necron bodies shattered beneath their blades. Fire and frost mingled in the rain. Wulfgar pulled his straps tight. His Crozius sparked in his bruised grip. He charged, living and dead, side by side. Witherman slapped the side of his Melta, cursing. The coolant pipes hissed, venting steam, still jammed. He threw the useless weapon aside and drew his Seeks in one smooth motion. Beside him, Lorimer fired short bursts from his bolter into the scarab swarm, each round bursting like miniature suns, but it wasn't enough. The floor shimmered with mandibles and skittering limbs. Gastward Cuthhelm engulfed a Necron in witchfire, his staff crackling with psychic flame. Before the construct's body hit the ground, Toonbald had grabbed Cuthhelm by the arm and pulled him behind cover. A Wurtweird knelt, spraying sealant foam over the librarian's leg, where flesh and ceramite had been flayed apart by a Gauss beam. On the western ramp, Captain Fayond, his jetpack half-melted and leaking coolant, fought with chainsword in hand. Back to back with Captain Sigibert, whose firing line was breaking apart. Shells clicked empty, sparks danced from failing armor. Fayond reached for another clip, found nothing, swore. He crouched beside a dying warrior and tore a fresh pack from the Marine's belt. When he looked up, he froze. A shape had darted into the melee. Hologram, surely? No. The warrior gleamed with Castafrazzi plate, edges blurred with ghost light. A power hammer arced through the rain, smashing a Necron into the stone. Another warrior faded into being beside him, then another. Their bolters sang, each shot flaring with spectral blue flame that tore through scarabs like burning ice. Fayond looked to Sigibert. The older captain stared, then shrugged. They resumed firing. From the broken gates and shattered walls, they came. First a few, then more. Void Revenants who should have been long dead, whose names were etched in stone and remembered only in mourning rites, stepped back onto the battlefield in silence. Their armor shimmered, ceramite blurred with unnatural frost. Eyes burned with pale fire. Runes etched in Wirthan script glowed faintly across their armor, each name a litany of sacrifice. One dropped beside Withermund, bolter raised. The ethereal warrior fired in staccato bursts, each shot phasing through steel and stone to ignite the souls of the Necrons it struck. Withermund blinked. But the wraith said nothing. It was already moving. A figure wearing the faded regalia of the Third Company stepped onto a collapsed bastion, raising a relic flamer. A gout of blue fire roared across a tide of scarabs. The thing screamed, and for the first time, the sound was not mechanical. Near the breach, Voxman Ordmere looked up from where he knelt over Harrogith, her body limp and burned. A spectral figure passed him without a word, embedding a power axe into the spine of a Cryptek guard. He whispered, "Geofon Hālgengas." Across the battlefield, others took up the cry. "Geofon Hālgengas, Fagward, for Welsiax." Even the dying joined in. On the southern wall, Chaplain Wulfgar rose again, bloodied and burned, Crozius sparking. He saw them, his brothers, returned from death to fight once more. Elfric, aglow with soulfire, raised his staff and led a charge of spectral warriors. They moved like lightning, silent, coordinated, unstoppable. Where their blades struck, Necron bodies fell and did not rise again. Even the Necrons hesitated. Warning subroutines spiked. Threat analyses spiraled into error. These were not living enemies. They could not be parsed, could not be logged. They were anomalies, and they were winning. Back to back, flesh and blood Void Revenants fought alongside their dead. Mortal and ghost, hammer and blade. Etheric flame mingled with bolter fire, warp light shimmered across broken stone. The rain turned black where it touched ghost steel. And above it all, echoing through the storm and static, a single unified cry. Geofon Hālgengas, fake word. Elfstan lowered his oculus and shook his head, utterly and for once lost for words. Well, said Heorowulf, surveying the carnage with a calm that was almost insulting, I think that's the distraction we were looking for. Elfstan turned to him, face still lit with disbelief. Yes, he said slowly, stepping down from the ridge and mounting his own assault bike. You could say they have our attention. Heorowulf kicked his bike into life. The engine growled low and deep, reverberating through the fractured ruin like the growl of some chained beast. He reached over and toggled the ignition on Elfstan's machine. I think, he said evenly, the storm crackling overhead, that despite this not being part of the plan, we'd be fools not to take advantage of it. Elfstan adjusted his targeting optics and linked to the squad vox. Thunder rolled above them, rain hissing against shattered stone and scarab corpses. You know, Captain, he muttered, checking the bolt pistol holster on his hip, it does look like it's raining out there. Heorowulf turned, his helm's lenses glowing amber in the murk. He paused, then gave a soft, distorted chuckle. You notice the strangest things, he replied, and gunned the engine. The bike screamed forward, tires chewing through shattered tile and debris as he shot through the broken archway and into the storm beyond. In the battle line, Wulfgar stood over Osric and Cinnabil. A Wurtweird crouched beside them, working swiftly to seal rent armor and torn flesh. The thick tang of burnt ceramite and blood hung heavy in the air, half masked by the constant downpour. He took a deep breath, his cracked ribs grinding as he looked up, and there was Cuthhelm limping past with his staff in hand. The librarian's leg was a ruin, bound tightly in splints made from shattered plating and scavenged rebar. Still he gave a sharp salute. We appear to have them on the run, Wulfgar, he said, the faintest grin on his rain-slick face. Wulfgar nodded. Yes, thanks to Elfric. He glanced out across the blasted field. Through the veil of smoke and rain shimmered the spectral form of the Void Revenants' first chief librarian, Elfric the Bound. His ghost stalked the battle line with commanding presence, blue fire clinging to his ruined staff, and around him, the translucent shapes of fallen brothers moved in perfect silence. Wraith helms glowed with pale witchlight, bolters and blades striking with ethereal precision. I said he'd come around in the end, Wulfgar added, half to himself. Cuthhelm stopped and looked back at the battlefield. He wiped a line of rain from his brow, then smiled with weary humor. Yes, I think being dead brought him out of the sullen slump he was in. Wulfgar choked back a laugh, brushing his soaked hair from his eyes. You know, you've a twisted sense of optimism. It's the only kind that works in this galaxy. Cuthhelm turned and scanned the horizon. The Necron forces were withdrawing now, warriors fading out of existence in green-tinted light, the battlefield falling still by degrees. He squinted toward the causeway that had once swarmed with enemy bodies. Now only the scorched shell of battle remained, and two dark shapes moving fast, armored assault bikes cutting through the smoke. Our ravens are loose, he observed. Wulfgar followed his gaze, watching the twin engines vanish toward the dark horizon. Yes, he said, it's up to Heorowulf now. If he fails, this victory is just a delay. Cuthhelm grunted. Then let's keep the enemy focused on us. Buy him time. The two warriors stood side by side, one limping, the other bloodied and bruised, surveying the remains of the field they had bled to hold. In the mud and fire, among ghostly allies and wounded kin, they found grim satisfaction. They had won a battle. But now the war truly began.